Good morning. We'll just be getting started in a moment. So good morning, everybody. We'll now get started on this morning's webinar. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. Just waiting, a few other people are coming in. Great, okay. So Alan, you can go on to the slide, please. Perfect. So thank you all for joining us this morning in the third of our data series where we're talking about data migration and getting it right at the critical stage. And we have a great panel with us today, so very much looking forward to the session. So just quickly some webinar etiquette. So to say that the session is being recorded and it will be available on demand later on today. You'll see there's a Q&A box. That's really for any questions that you have for any of the panel today. Please do put your questions in. We really want this to be as interactive as possible. And if we don't get to cover all of them this morning, we will follow up with any questions afterwards. You'll see there's a chat box that's really for any more technical issues, and my colleagues are in the background and they'll be keeping an eye on that. So I'm Joyce Harman, I'm Head of Client Services at Hart Square, and as I say, we have a very exciting panel joining us today. We have Natalie Sherd, who's the Data Migration Manager and BA at Alzheimer's Research. We've also got Steve Bland, the Technical Product Owner from Alzheimer's Research. We've got Kevin Chowdhury, the Head of Data at Giveclarity, and my colleague Alan Peristrello, Managing Director of Hart Square. But also interesting, as you see, we have two people from Alzheimer's Research, and that's because they had two specific roles on the data migration strand of the project, and we're going to talk about that a bit later. So just quickly, for those that are not aware of Hart Square, just to say we're consultancy practice, we work only within the non-for-profit sector. And as you can see, we've got lots of stats and been around for a long time. And one of the important parts about us being fiercely independent. So looking at Hart Square and what we do, we generally kind of cover 4 specific areas around all technology change projects, everything from strategy, selection, implementation, and benefits realization. So now, looking at the data series, as you see, we're on we're on 3 of the series, and the recordings are available for the previous ones. And also to say the final one coming up about leveraging data for impact is on the 22nd of October. So please register for that if you haven't already. So now hand over to you, Alan.
Thanks, Joyce. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the third in our data series. This one is focused specifically on data migration, and the subtitle here is Getting It Right at the Critical Stage, which I think summarizes things really well. From my experience, been doing this for almost 18 years with a number of projects. Data migration is by far and away the hardest and most tricky part of a project to achieve, but it's also the one that probably gets the least sort of attention and detail from a sort of publicity perspective. So we're hoping to change that today. So we've got some great guests joining us who are real champions on this topic. And they've got some really interesting insights to share. So hopefully we can get going. I thought it would be useful just to set the scene around data migration, and probably first starting with addressing data migration's kind of bad name in the project space. So if we take a look at costs and overruns, according to a Gartner report, 83% of data migration projects fail or exceed their budgets or schedules. I'm pleased to say that I don't think we see anything near that in our NFP space. I think that the projects that do get delivered successfully in the main. That isn't to say that data migration elements of the project aren't tricky, but we don't see anything near as high as those numbers. 60% of CRM projects fail to meet their overall expectations or objectives due to poor data quality and or inaccurate data migration. I think that can kind of come into things a little bit more in the space in terms of what we see. I certainly wouldn't think it's 60%, but it's certainly higher than it should be. So hopefully we can shine a spotlight through sessions like this on the value of data migration and the importance that it plays, and bring it to the fore. Looking at the value of data quality, So 89% of companies that perform thorough data cleansing prior to migration, which I think is a really important point, report much fewer issues post-migration and through the life cycle of their CRM. And when we take a look then outside of data quality, what are the biggest challenges that projects typically face? According to a Bloor research report, 45% of the challenge typically happens in the data mapping side of things, and then data transformation, which is where you're having to take data that may, be in a specific format for your old CRM and moving it to your new one may not fit. There's quite a lot of difficulty and challenges there. And then the actual data integration, the actual point of putting it into the systems and working with it is actually the lowest component. I would argue that the 45% allocated to data mapping is predominantly around trying to make the old systems match the new, and a lot of that can also be about process alignment and making sure that your new processes and your new systems are aligned to the way your data works or used to work. I thought it's useful just to share some sort of inspirational quotes, as I always do at this stage, and I thought this was a really nice quote about data migration is often underestimated. It definitely isn't a technical task. And it certainly should be part of that business change and transformation. And it's typically when organizations get to start or see or go through their transformation process or their data migration process that they see and realize how much change needs to take place. So my advice with this would always be recognize this and embed the requirement to change in your overall project and process. Another one that I think is quite useful is that your system is only as good as the data it holds, which is kind of an obvious statement. But really, to ensure that your system delivers on your strategic objectives, you do have to go back to what is the purpose of the CRM and what is its goal and how is it going to further your organization's goals and missions, or else it will just be another system that just holds data. So looking at the formal process of data migration, I thought it was useful just to define what is data migration. So here we have a definition, a process of selecting, preparing, extracting, and transforming data to permanently transfer from one system to another. What does that actually look like when it's aligned with your overall project process? When in a discovery stage, you would typically conduct an audit, and that might be done by the organization yourselves, or it might be done by your technology partner. In a lot of cases where Hart are involved, we encourage a data audit before going into, potentially looking at suppliers, and that means that you can allow your suppliers to understand the state of your data and what role they need to play in it. I think not being transparent about that or not looking to make that transparent can bring issues later down the line in the project. So if you do conduct an audit of your data, I would always make that transparent as part of the process. Your technology partner will then, in the discovery process, take a look at that, do their own audit, and do a design process to map how the future state solution will map to your new one. And then that moves into the implementation stage once discovery is signed off. And that's really where the hard work starts to take place. So on the back end, and we'll dig into the implementation stage a little bit future in the next slide. And then you get to the UAT stage. And this is really the critical stage. UAT is an acronym for user acceptance testing. And it's at this stage that the organization should be taking responsibility for testing the system, the solution, but fundamentally how the data that's been loaded into that system all works out. And then you move to a migration stage once that's been successful and approved. You go into go live, and an oft forgotten stage is to make sure that you archive the old data. And that isn't as simple as just turning off the old system. You do need to have an archival strategy in place. Looking at what does an implementation stage within the data migration look like, I thought this is really kind of useful to explain the detail of what's actually happening. The majority of this is done typically by the technology partner, but with integration and collaboration with the client and key stakeholders, as we'll hear from our guests shortly. So data is extracted from your existing system, and that is data then loaded into a staging environment, typically something in the development environment. Clients typically don't see that. And in that stage, people looking to do basic cleanse tasks, looking to consolidate the data, essentially looking to identify how many duplicate records may have been brought over. And then that data is kind of exported into the staging system. Once that comes into the staging system, data is then validated and mapped to the new solution. So in other words, you might have salutation and title being confused. It might be things like that need to be translated. Typically, this is less of an issue in the sort of contact record stage, but a lot more relevant when you get down to what I'd consider sort of functional transactional processing elements. typically finance records, etc., need to be transformed because your old solution will not have the data stored necessarily in exactly the right format to meet your new solution. And that's where a lot of energy goes into making sure that when the data does come over, finally, it is in the correct transformation process or status. Data is then loaded, typically into a data migration or a UAT environment, and then that data is validated. Once the data is validated, you will note that you need to do a lot of backwards and forwards testing, and I've set down an X number of runs. Traditionally, your technology partner will define how many data migration runs they will do. So in other words, how many times they will repeat this process, because you can expect a high degree of failure in the first kind of iterations as people migrate the data and then look at it collaboratively and realize, oh, we thought that, but actually it means this, and we need to go back and redo the data. Now, it's usually through those exercises, preferably done earlier in the project than reaching the UAT stage, that issues are found. And if they're identified early, then the plan can be adjusted, the solution can be adjusted to accommodate those. Nothing's worse than coming at that final stage and finding all these difficulties as you enter UAT. And once that's validated, so everything's been validated as now, that's been ticked to be green, then you move into the UAT stage. So before moving on to our kind of poll question, I thought it was useful to bring in Kevin from Giveclarity to get his opinion on this. Do appreciate, Kevin, that not all processes look like this. This is kind of very high level and vanilla. So your thoughts on that and where you find the biggest challenges?
Yeah, thanks, Alan. So a couple of comments on your process that you've outlined there. So we typically have two options in terms of the extract and transform. Either we can do it, which is what you said, the technology partner working on that, or we'd offer our clients the option to do the extract and transform themselves. And that's a really, really key decision about whether to do that. There are pros and cons, but it's really going to depend on the client's technical skills and their institutional knowledge of their data, which obviously is the partner. We don't have that institutional knowledge. So that's a potential benefit if they have the technical skills. But it's really important not to underestimate how difficult that extract and transform stage is. It's very complicated, particularly when you're dealing with large volumes of data. So that's perhaps slightly different from what you outlined there. In terms of the iterative loads, building up to production load. So we typically only do 3 milestone loads: a sample load, a UAT load, and then the production load. The sample loads essentially is stuff going roughly where we expect it to go, and with all the referential integrity hanging together correctly. And we do that on a small data set. And then we do a UAT load, which is a full data load for everything, a dress rehearsal for the production load. And that is the thing we really need signed off to move to the final stages of the data migration. And we also use that load as well to work out what the cutover window is going to be. So we can work out timings for that, and then we move to the production load. So we do quite a small number of loads, and that's just partly because there's just the volumes of data that we deal with and the systems we're loading into. Like running a full load is very complicated. It's very time intensive and uses a lot of resources. So we might do little unit tests in between, but those are the three main loads that we do.
Brilliant, thank you. Probably useful to step over and introduce Natalie from Alzheimer's Research UK. Natalie, you were the data migration lead effectively on the project. Your involvement in that stage, aligning with kind of how the Giveclarity guys worked with you?
Yeah, so we had one sample load relatively early on, and it was very, very small. And we did use that just to check that the general process was working. And it was very useful because we did learn a lot from just the kinds of errors that were coming up and knowing how things were linking and that kind of thing. And then the next load was the UAT one, which was basically an exact replica of what production would be. So that was the first sort of full test. And then it was production. So we had 2 tests and then the final load.
Yeah, great. And in terms of my very high level stats that I've put up there in terms of test 1, test 2, how did you guys find that? I mean, I've seen worse numbers than that, to be honest with you. You know, that's typically around data. Were you prepared for that? Did your plan take that into account?
Yeah, especially for the sample load, the plan was just get some data in and see what happens. The hope was that some would be correct, but it was very much we'll see what happens. There wasn't really, it went better than we expected, but we weren't really sure how it would go. So we tried to not sort of set the expectations too high for that. And then based off of that, we were a lot more confident with UAT, with what needed to be done in preparation for that. I would say UAT, when it did go very well, there were errors that needed fixing, but nothing was particularly major. Like everything went into the objects eventually. There were just relatively minor things that needed fixing along the way. So I would say that those stats for us probably are fairly accurate. Yeah.
That's good to know, and I think that speaks to a well planned but also well resourced project, which I think is a topic that I think we'll dig into a bit later, about the fact that, you know, knowing that that's the size of the challenge and being honest about it and having people in place to deal with it, rather than kind of hoping it's all going to go just fine and then, you know, get to that stage. So yeah, that's really useful. I'd be interested now to switch over to a poll, Joyce, just to see what you know, our audience, where they're at in terms of their current projects, and appreciate some of these will be different to different people's experience.
Perfect, thanks, Alan. Yeah, so I've just put up the poll, and this is really just to understand who's with us this morning, kind of what stage you're at. So you're at the early stages, thinking about, you know, your project, your mid-project, getting ready for the data migration phase. You've gone live, so you're kind of now thinking about usage of system and data afterwards. You don't have an active project, or you're evaluating systems. So I'm just going to let that run for another couple of seconds. And the majority of people, which is probably not a surprise based on the topic for today, is that most people are mid-project and at that data migration phase. So let me just quickly end the poll and let me share the results. Okay, so yeah, so the vast majority of people are in those early stages of either the replacement of a project, so therefore will then be in that thinking about data and what they need to do, and then people that are moving into that actual data migration phase. So that's really interesting. So thank you everyone for answering that. So I'm going to stop sharing, and then to really go into a bit more detail to talk to our lovely guests this morning. So really wanted to understand, Steve, if I could bring you in here just to give us a little bit of background on the actual project, sort of the history of the project.
Sure, yeah. So we went live with Salesforce in December last year, December 23. And it took a while to get there. The implementation phase was probably about 18 months. But in reality, we had our first assessment by an external partner of CRM viability in mid-2019. And I think it is worth stressing that it took us a long time to get to having Salesforce go live. But in terms of the background, yeah, the main drivers were we were using Razor's Edge 7 and we were becoming too big for it. And we wanted to move from a fundraising database to an organizational CRM.
Perfect. And I think, you know, it is an interesting point, and one we can pick up on a bit more is the length of time of a project. You know, a project doesn't just start from you start your implementation. It's all the work that has to go into, you know, choosing your partner. And as you say, yeah, you chose Giveclarity on this one. So I wanted to just expand a bit more into sort of the project roles, because I know Alan sort of alluded to this already. So how did you sort of set up the project team for the management of data, so particularly around that data migration phase, because I know yourself and Natalie had two kind of very specific roles. So perhaps actually, Natalie, if you'd like to expand on what you were saying already about your role on the project, and then equally same question to you, Steve.
Yeah, so I was the data migration manager, and previous to that, I had been in the database management team at AI UK for I think by the time the project had actually started, it'd been about 2 years. So I led on all of the migration work, but I did work very closely with the rest of the team and especially Steve. But I was doing the transforming of the data, working very closely with our the partner at Giveclarity, who was doing the migration work on their side, doing all of the scripts, doing all of the error checking, the validation, everything like that.
Perfect. And Steve?
So I was the product owner for the Salesforce implementation. So essentially the AR UK's side responsible for the design alongside the consultants at Giveclarity. And likewise, I'd been at AR UK's beforehand as database manager. So I kind of knew a lot of the teams and what they were trying to achieve. But yeah, as the project went on, Natalie and I had a lot of meetings around what migrating data to something that's been newly designed actually looks like.
Yeah, perfect. I think actually that's an interesting point we can cover in a minute about kind of that structure, that governance structure, and kind of cadence of how often you are kind of meeting up and all of those kind of things. But Kevin, I wanted to bring you in, really your experience from a technology partner side about the reality of resources that are put on client side phase for data migration, because to me, I would say that Alzheimer's Research UK were very lucky that had a good resourced team for this. What would your experience be in general?
Yeah, absolutely. I should say, first of all, I had no involvement in this particular project. So as a data consultant, so I can't take any credit for it, much though I'd like to. So as far as resourcing is concerned, so Alzheimer's obviously went down the route that I outlined before, where they extract and transform the data, and we did the load process, which worked really well for them because, as they've already alluded to, they had a lot of institutional knowledge around the data. They had strong technical skills. I think, Steve, you mentioned before that you've done previous data warehousing and migration work, so you were really well set up to do that, and was definitely the right choice for their organization. That isn't always the case, where there's technical skill sets not as strong, or the understanding of the data is not as strong, then that might not be the best choice. But either way, the people that we really rely on at the client, or the two roles we really rely on, will be a business product owner or a role similar to that, the business person responsible for the data, and then a data analyst or data engineer. And they're such key roles, and particularly the data analyst role, that they need to be, if at all possible, fully resourced for the project, because it's going to take a huge bite out of their time, and it's a really stressful job as well, and not something you want to be doing alongside your day job. So if that's possible, that's definitely hugely advantageous. And those are the people we really rely on. There's a couple of other roles that we would need help from, typically IT infrastructure and the internal project manager. But yeah, it's that business data person and then the technical data person that we heavily rely on.
Yeah, perfect. And actually, which nicely comes into my next question, which was really thinking about alignment with project manager and, to making sure that the project is running to time. But actually, just to pick up one of those points, Natalie and Steve, was this your sole role, just working on the project, or were you also doing business as usual things? Just to kind of get an idea of kind of the amount of your time that was taken on the project. I don't know which one of you'd like to jump in on that first.
Yeah, so for both of us, it was, as I say, because this project had quite a long timeline, we were able to put in place long-term plans and get senior buy-in at a really early stage, which meant that when it came to actually resourcing the project team, the awareness of the requirement for a new CRM was well established throughout the senior leadership, which in turn meant that the arguments for resourcing fell on people on ears who'd already heard it, which helped. So yeah, both Natalie, myself, and a couple of others in the team as well were fully resourced on the project for the whole time.
Yeah, which makes such a huge difference on the project. And I suppose thinking about, because you say you both had those roles, was there sort of a governance structure you put in for both of you working together on the project, sort of, touch points, check-ins, stand-ups, that kind of thing? What was the general sort of way you worked on the project? Don't know if Natalie, you want to pick up on that?
So I think at the start we had sort of more ad hoc meetings, and then as the project kind of ramped up and there were more changes being implemented with like the way the processes would work and the way the data would look, we ended up having weekly meetings, which we probably, to be honest, could have had more. There was a lot. And as well as the weekly meetings, we were also having just general conversations. Like if questions came up that I wasn't sure how they were going to deal with a certain process in Salesforce versus in RE, I would ask and we would have a conversation. Or if Steve was aware that something was changing, he would let me know. So there was pretty much constant back and forth to make sure that what was being designed in Salesforce and what was going to be implemented would match up with how the data was going to be moved over, and that I could map it correctly. So yeah, there was a lot of conversation.
Perfect. We've had some great questions come in so far, so please keep putting in your questions. So I wanted to pick up on Kevin's point about the project manager, because obviously all projects like this have a dedicated project manager, or should definitely have. How did that work with, that, again, governance structure, working with the project manager to make sure that your data strand was aligned with the overall project plan? Steve?
Yeah, so we did have an internal project manager who was fully resourced, and they worked very closely with the project manager at Giveclarity. I think they had weekly, and I'm fairly sure at certain points almost daily conversations around various different things, so that the two sort of working groups were kept aligned. Yeah, it did work really well.
Can I jump in there?
Absolutely, Kevin.
I was just going to say that in terms of the project plan, the migration kind of sits slightly off to one side. Typically, we work in a sprint-based project planning system, but the sprints for developing the rest of the system typically too short for our migration cycles of sample, UAT, and production loads. So there is some alignment work to do between the functional sprints that are going on, and the data migration stages, which can be complicated. And I think it's kind of been alluded to already, but to stress, while Alzheimer's are internally talking with their functional side as well, and making sure that things align between the migration and the functional development, that's happening at the partner as well. There's a lot of interaction between the migration consultant, the data consultant, and the lead functional consultant on the project, because a lot of the work that's happening on the rest of the system is driving requirements for the data migration. So there's a lot of interaction there as well.
No, absolutely, yeah, Kevin, completely agree, and not to be forgotten about at all. So I want to make sure that we allow plenty of time for Q&A. So I was just going to ask all three of you, kind of what would be your learnings from this project? Kevin, I'll ask you more sort of general sort of points in general on these type of projects. So, and I know Natalie and Steve, you worked really closely on this, so you probably have the same kind of key learnings, but I'm going to go to Natalie first for yours.
I think for me, a main one would be having the knowledge of how the system was currently being used, how the teams worked, their processes, what their ideal data sort of would look like was a huge benefit. I think at the time it would have taken to become familiar with that would have been very difficult to do that alongside all of the other sort of technical work. So having that knowledge already was a massive advantage, and Steve having that knowledge already meant that the two of us were able to make decisions that felt informed, because obviously teams didn't necessarily have the understanding of the impact certain decisions would make. So we were able to either make the decisions on their behalf or have discussions with them whilst also already having existing knowledge, and help explain the impact that certain decisions around their data would have on other teams. So that would probably be my main one.
Perfect. Steve, anything additional to
Yeah, I
add?
would actually. I would say I think the other one that we probably learned was that starting early is key. It's a lot easier to build out the basics and then change it than it is to wait and start to build everything once it's 100% complete. By that I mean, if you're migrating sort of constituents from Razor's Edge, you can start working like first name and last name. They exist. They're going to move. It's not going to be that much different. If some of the other stuff ends up being finessed later on, it's much easier to change that than it is to wait until everything's perfect before even starting on the basics. So yeah, start early.
Yeah, I 100% agree. You can never start on data early enough. Kevin.
Yeah, so like some of the things that have been touched on already, so I won't labor them. Allocate enough time. It's often underestimated. Those stats Alan was showing at the start are often because they go over budget because they were under-resourced at the start. So I think that's key. Understanding the complexity of the extract transform stage, I've already talked about a bit, and be honest about your limitations and understand, you know, can you do this? What help are you going to need? And a good way to see that, and see what your limitations might be is to start early, have a crack at something, right? We started to suggest with our clients when making that kind of who's going to do the extract and transform stage, here's a thing to do. Go and do this relatively simple thing to extract and transform some data from your source system, right? If you struggle with that, then maybe you're going to need some more support in that area. So again, yeah, start early. And another benefit of starting early is if you can get a bit of an end-to-end on the migration process, you'll iron out all the irritating technical challenges that you might find, and then you can work on the stuff that really matters, the business stuff, the mapping stuff, and not get halfway down the road and suddenly go, I've got a technical issue that's going to take 3 or 4 days to resolve and slows everything down. So yeah, there's all kind of been talked about a little bit before. Worth touching, I think, on reconciliation and testing of migration data. Yeah, getting users to do their testing is a bit like getting kids to eat their vegetables. And on data, doubly so. Yeah, trying to get in early on setting what your expectations are on people for doing testing on the data migration. And I think Alan and Natalie, you did really well on testing from conversations we've had previously. I can't remember exactly what your strategy was there, but I seem to remember you did good work on that.
Yeah, we had quite a few different types of testing. So we had subject matter experts for each of the teams, and they had testing to do with the actual, like, how Salesforce was built, the functionality, and then they were also testing the migrated data. A learning from that would definitely be give people structure, because people, if you just ask someone to go and have a look and let you know, they won't mention things. They'll wait a few weeks and then they'll say, oh, well, when I was looking at it, I didn't like this, but they won't have mentioned it at the time. So I found if you give people specific things to look at, and specific sort of the type of feedback that you want, you're going to get much better result from the testing if you're asking people that don't know the technical aspect. And also having side-by-side comparisons. So people looking at the old system and looking at the new system and seeing if the data that they rely on in the old system, if they can find it in the new system and if it looks how they want it to. So yeah, we had a lot of different testing and it went over quite a long period of time.
Perfect, yeah. And I think I love that structure. Absolutely. I suppose we all kind of forget that not everybody working on this project is going to be technical, and people have not done this before and it's not their day job. So yeah, helping them along the way. And as you said, Kevin, like children. So yeah, I think that's That's a really good point. So I was just going to move on to a poll, which is actually talking about people's challenges around data. So if you bear with me while I bring that up. 1 second. So what we're just really trying to get a bit more of an understanding here is, what are your biggest challenges? So knowing where the data sits in your organization, having that data that's high quality and usable, having that confidence in your data. Do you have the skills and knowledge internally to actually utilize and understand what is within your data, or that your current system just really doesn't make that quite difficult? Or final one, there's just too much of it. So I'm going to let that run just for another second, and then winning at the moment is our current system makes it difficult to query. So I'm going to end the poll and let me share the results. So yeah, it's quite interesting having that data that's high quality and usable, and equally followed by the confidence in data. I don't know if Kevin, if you wanted to comment on that at all.
Yeah, sure. I mean, data quality is an area where it can absorb vast amounts of time and resource. So and migration is an opportunity to improve data quality. But I have some caution around that. And if you're going to do data cleaning as part of the migration process, to set really strict boundaries on what you are and what you're not going to do, and what the business benefit of doing it is, because it can absorb a huge amount of time and resource. And the simple fact of the matter is your data will never be clean. So you can basically spend forever trying to clean it and you will never get there. So understanding what the benefits are for cleaning it, for each item that you're going to do, and how much time you're going to spend on it, and what is the threshold for saying, okay, that's good enough.
Yeah, definitely. I agree. There kind of has to be a cut-off point. So thank you. So I'm going to stop sharing, and then I'm going to hand back to Alan.
Thanks, Joyce. There's actually something I was gonna just pick up actually on something that Kevin was saying, and I think it links back to something that we addressed in the second series of the data series around data quality, and that is it's kind of an interesting sort of point to bring in mind here is that it's probably worth, if you are going to go into looking at doing a data quality exercise as part of the project, do it as soon as you possibly can. I think one of our questions that have been posed kind of alludes to that point, which I think is very valid. But I think the point I wanted to make was that find the root cause of what those issues are. If you're finding a lot of data quality things, try and find the root cause, because actually in the project, that might then be something that can be addressed by the new solution. It might be an erroneous calculation that might be happening in the old system that's just always been there and people have accepted it and they just work around it. So try and find the root cause of things. And that can be an interesting exercise, but that really should have been done really kind of at the audit stage. So if you're going to sort of tackle the data quality piece, do understand what good looks like before you start that process as well. And then the other thing that I thought was interesting out of that poll was that the second highest sort of response number there was kind of current system makes it difficult to query the data. So we don't really know where we are. And I think we see that quite often with clients where despite their intention to do it, they just kind of can't because they don't have the right tools at their disposal. So useful insight there from the poll. Yeah, I wanted to just move to looking really at roles and responsibilities, and I think this is a great example of what Alzheimer's Research UK did to ensure project success. This is an adaptation of the data governance roles and responsibilities slide that we used in the first of the data series around strategy, and making sure that you have the right people in place to do the right jobs. And I think we've Natalie said it best, I think, where you've got to have data owners, people who understand and own the data. I think it's important to see that technology and partners, IT department and your technology partner are not those people. Your data owners are people who understand where the data is stored, how it is used, and what its limits are. So those are really important people. Equally, on the other side of that graph, this image is the product and subject owners. So people who understand how the data is going to be used and how it aligns with the process. And I think if you do have in your organization business analysts, they really should be quite intricately involved in the data. And I think that they become essential for helping make sure that the testing regime that you put in place to test the data is understood, because testing without understanding the process is kind of a bit pointless. And then the bit in the middle that I think really often gets lost is kind of who's the data steward, who's the board member person that owns this and understands the need to invest in the data side, and specifically, as Alzheimer's research did, invest in the people to ensure that you have dedicated resources. So I think, Steve, you alluded to this point at one point, that there was kind of a board level buy-in to support this process, and that kind of illustrates the good governance in place at Alzheimer's research. Any more to add on the value of a well-positioned data steward to make this project work?
I mean, I'll just say again that it took us a long time to get there, and yeah, the entire project, once we got the implementation onwards, was signed off by the trustees themselves, not just by the ELT or the leadership team here. It was the full trustees that signed off the entire project. So you had that buy-in right from the very top, which then meant that when it came to putting in place business sponsors, and it meant that we could, within our project team internally, we could talk to them and let them know, and we were actually able to articulate to the wider organization that this is the priority, and therefore anything else coming up, actually no, we want you as users of the system essentially to prioritize this project. And that was able to come from the top. So when we were struggling, certain teams weren't able to commit resource or something like that, we actually had an escalation point where we could go up and go, look, if we need this team to do this by this, and that could be passed down from someone senior, because the buy-in was there all the way down, which was invaluable.
Yeah, great. And I think that it shows in the sort of the fact, I think it, for me, the best illustration of the fact that investment was worth it is kind of something that Natalie said, that actually UAT wasn't too surprising and it wasn't too painful. I mean, let's be honest, UAT is always quite painful, but if you're prepared for it and it isn't more painful and you kind of know what you're expecting to see, that to me is the ultimate illustration of good foundations laid early. As you say, it took a long time to get there, but it's that kind of recognition and foresight from people across the organization to recognize that need, and that it isn't just about functionality in a system. So that is really useful and a kind of key takeaway. So moving forward, it's at this point where we always try and share sort of 6 tips. This is a hard one because there's just so many nuggets of information that our guests could share. And I think there are actually people on the call who could probably offer their own, which would be great if there are delegates who want to add to this list. So these are mine, kind of just to sort of summarize how I see it, is define your goals. And I think this is often forgotten, and make sure that it aligns with your data strategy. So, what are the key objectives that you've set out in your data strategy? Is data quality one of them? Try and make sure that that's addressed. If you're trying to make sure that you've got greater security, kind of align that into how you're going to undertake the sort of data migration piece. And then something that I think really is important is at the earliest stage of the project, sit down with your partner and understand and agree what the validation criteria are. What does good look like? I think Kevin said, quite clearly, you're never going to get to 100%. I've worked on projects where that mythical grail is always expected, and no matter how many iterations you do, you're never going to get there. So understand what good looks like, and understand how you measure that, so that you can actually keep the project moving forward. That isn't to say just make it a low value goal, just go tick, yeah, it's done, and then move on, because you will have a lot of problems in BAU. Roles and resource, I think this is an excellent example where having the right people in place to support this. I think where I've seen data migration be an issue is clients not always understanding the value of having dedicated, experienced resources. And if you don't have them on board, bring them on board. There are people you can bring on board who can help with this. I think that's a kind of key lesson that you can take away. Don't try and do this if you don't have key people in place to do the heavy lifting and the work. Start early, which I think is one of the things that's referenced in one of the Q&A points that have been raised, is start early. Try and bring everything in that plan further to the left. test as often as you can and bring your data in to make sure that you're finding the problems and give yourself time to address and adapt them. Don't assume that this will just sort itself out in UAT. This is kind of a mini project in and of itself. It needs its own attention and detail. Evaluate your data quality, understand whose responsibility it is to do the cleansing and deduping. I think, as Kevin kind of alluded, in this case, a lot of that responsibility was taken on board by Alzheimer's research, which shows a great degree of responsibility from the client. And understanding your data before you extract it is kind of really important. Work with your partner through implementation to validate and correct the data. If it's an iterative release model, do that at every release and try and tease out where those problems are. They exist. The sooner you find them, the better your project will be as you progress through them. Do thorough testing. I think this is something that everyone will tell you. Test. Ensure that you have a well-defined and understood test plan in place. Make sure that you have test records defined so that you know what you're looking for, so you can do comparisons between your existing system and your new system. And then finally, assume that you will not go live with 100% accurate system and data, and plan for that. So I've put this down as continuous improvement. I think it's very important and healthy to see go live as the start of a new journey. And I think that your plan in hypercare needs to be focused on addressing the 10% or the 5% of known bugs and issues that you're going to have. And sometimes that's going to be around data. So do assume that they are there and plan for them. I do recognize that projects can be quite tiring, and that's the point where fatigue is at its highest. But it is important to plan to see that through. So then moving to kind of my top tips, finishing things up before we hand back to Q&A, and I would welcome our guests commenting on this. So a couple of do's from me: plan effectively and start early. Ensure senior stakeholders to get support, if that means resource or budget, make them aware of it. Definitely do not undersell this element when you're putting the project business case together. It is critical to overall and long-term success. Ensure the roles are clear and well understood across the project team. I have seen projects where people are in place, but actually they don't really know who's doing what. So that's really important. Make sure that those roles are well defined, and look for advice and guidance if you're not sure, to make sure that they've been validated. Something that I think Natalie and Steve both mentioned is backfill the data owners. You're going to be putting some responsibility on your SMEs, your subject matter experts. If they're data owners in their own right, give them time and space to deal with this. Don't give it to them at the last minute, because they will push back and you will have project issues. So try and do this as much as possible, where you can backfill people and recognize they've got responsibility. Allow your SMEs time, but not too much. Don't give them too much time, because they will just flit it away. And know how many data runs you're going to get. So Kevin was very clear when he illustrated how Giveclarity approach it. Different partners approach this differently. So do make sure that you understand very clearly what's in the budget from your tech partner in terms of how many data runs they're going to do. What happens if it doesn't work? Find out where the responsibility lies, and then figure that out before you commence the implementation stage. Really important to have that known. And then agree your validation parameters early. So know what good looks like and know what you're testing for. There's nothing worse than going into a test process and just assuming that everybody knows what good looks like. Write it down, make sure that it's agreed and accepted across all parties, and make sure that you know your test types. So isolate some test records, find some problematic ones, find some ones that cause people in the fundraising team challenges, and try find those ones and try and weed them out. Try and figure out what it looks like in the new system and how they prefer. And then a key point that was raised earlier in preparation for this by Steve was kind of ensure that permissions on UAT and live match. So if you've got a target state for live and you know what those permissions look like, make sure that when you're doing the data testing in UAT or before, that the right people's permissions are testing the right data, because you can get false anomalies, you can get false positives in that situation. And then looking at don'ts, don't obviously set unrealistic timelines. I personally think it's preferable, and I appreciate this is a budgetary topic, but don't share the UAT environment and the data migration environment. UAT can get messy. People use, funny records, test this, test that, and do things very quickly. that can cause issues when you're trying to validate the data. So try and keep them separate. A point that I know Kevin's quite big on, don't try and over automate this. There are lots of tools out there and they're great. And I know that Alzheimer's research used a specific tool, but don't try and over automate this or boil the ocean. You should be doing this data migration once. So don't do it, try and spend too much time on it. And then don't make structural changes in the source system, in other words, your old system, and in the middle of a project. Now, it sounds fairly obvious, and yeah, of course, don't do that, but it does happen. And so it really has to be remembered that, do not make structural changes. I mention this point because if projects don't stick to the original plan for whatever reason, and the project plan elongates, reality steps in and changes do need to be made to the source system. Keep tabs of that, try and keep on top of it. So don't do happy path testing. That doesn't work. You do need to find the problems, go looking for them. Always remember to anonymize records when you're testing, and then don't forget to retain an archive of your old data. You do need that. So BAU going forward, you do need an archival strategy. So I'm very happy to look into those in more detail for our guests, but looking at timing, I think it's probably perfect time to jump over to answering some Q&A topics.
Perfect. Thank you, Alan. Yes, as always, just conscious of time. So bear with me while I read this one out, but I think it's kind of a good point and a question. So I'd like to challenge the emphasis on UAT. It's better to shift testing left in the process as much as possible. I agree that multiple cycles are likely, but if you've reconciled the ELT process earlier in the process, then the effectiveness of UAT is maximized and the impact on the organization reduced. Going to go to you, Kevin, first. Any comments on that? So challenging the emphasis really on UAT.
I think so. I'm not quite sure exactly where the questioner is sort of leading with this. Is a suggestion that front loading more of the testing before the big UAT load is beneficial. Yes, I see that, and there is kind of hidden unit testing going on before the UAT load, because you're validating data before you put it into the system as well. So that is happening. Really, we go with the big UAT sign off because as I say, because of being able to present the entire data set and be able to test everything together as a unified whole, sorry, for the end users is often a lot more useful than unit testing individual things, and you can't see how everything links together. There's also a lot of system batch process type testing that needs to happen on migrated data, which is normally going to need all the data or a vast majority of the data over a number of domains as well, which you can't really very easily test in isolation. So, but I mean, it's a perfectly reasonable point, and yes, again, it goes with this spirit of go early and find out as much as you possibly can, and to some extent that is kind of what the sample load is doing as well.
Yeah, perfect. So I just want to make sure to get to another couple of questions. So I'm going to go to you, Natalie, with this one. So as part of the governance and decision making, did you have something equivalent to a centre of excellence?
We had, I don't know, Steve might be better at answering this question, actually.
I'm giving you all the horror. Steve, your thoughts?
Not explicitly, no. That has come about post go live with work with Giveclarity to develop that. In terms of governance and decision making, we had a full-time project manager internally, and we had each different stream as a different work stream. So we had migration, we had integration, we had build, we had work on data warehouse. They're all different streams managed by a project manager who was internally, and she, again, had come from an internal background, so she also understood all the internal workings of the organization, and she was full-time. And so we managed it as a project with the usual project management tools. So rather than having any explicit center of excellence, we had a project management set up.
Perfect. And then just to get in possibly one final question, and I'm going to go to you, Kevin, on this one. So how does migrating data from several source systems to a single target system impact a data migration project? What can be done to mitigate these challenges?
Well, obviously, needless to say, it complicates it. It's going to, in terms of resourcing and planning, it's going to be more than the sum of the parts, if you will. You should be using a single consolidation migration environment. So you're going to want to have a single environment where you extract all the data from all of your source systems to deal with it in a single place. And then you're assuming the data is interrelated, of course, but that's my assumption there. And then your primary challenges obviously will be the referential integrity between the two sources. But yeah, I think getting everything in a single place and dealing with there. Don't try and certainly don't try and migrate direct to your target system separately from each source. They should be coming into a single staging environment.
Perfect. And I'm conscious that I'm sure that Steve and Natalie have lots of comments on that, but I'm conscious of time. So what I'm going to do is hand back to Alan. But for the other questions that we haven't answered, we will follow up and answer those afterwards. So just to say to make sure that we will do that. So I'm going to hand back to Alan.
Thanks, Joyce. Kind of just wanted to put something up to sort of close things off. I found this quote, couldn't really attribute to who it had come from, but I thought it was quite nice. Data that is loved tends to survive. And obviously that means that you need to understand its value, you need to know it, and you need to give it the due care and attention. I think there's been a lot of discussion today around the quality of data. But I think specifically around data migration, I think this point around it's not about the tools or the functionality that are responsible for your CRM migration, but it's the quality that drives it, and the people who understand it being kind of intricately involved. So kind of from my perspective, a successful CRM migration hinges on thorough planning, understanding the value of quality data, dedicated people in product and data owners, experienced partners who can guide you through this and tell you what good looks like, and have got the tools and the experience to undertake their part in it, and then really rigorous testing. I'd probably actually add to that a recognition that you probably will need to keep working at this even after go live. But thinking specifically about the migration, I thought that was a useful way to close things off. I wanted to use this opportunity to thank our guests from Alzheimer's Research and from Giveclarity. Really do appreciate the time that they spend on these topics. Hopefully everyone on the call today found it useful. Please do complete the post-event survey. Your feedback really does help us understand where we need to improve on all aspects. Feedback that's critical is welcome. So please don't be scared to provide us with feedback on that. And if you are interested in joining our other events, please don't feel free to log on to our events portal, which can be either found on the QR code or via our website or in our newsletters. We do have another event coming up on the 22nd, which will be the final of this series around data. So if you have been participating with us, thank you for joining us on Data 3 and looking forward to seeing you on Data 4. Once again, thank you to our guests from Alzheimer's Research and Giveclarity, and I hope you have a great day. Thanks, everyone. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alan.